A possible conflict between Ukraine and Russia currently has the entire geopolitical scenario on edge. It has been impacting everything from equity to commodities, and the fears are growing that any kind of military action by Russia into Ukraine will lead to sanctions by the Western world, including the United States, the UK and the EU. Now, we need to understand first what this conflict is all about and why there are so many concerns. Why does it have world markets roiling as well? To do that, I'm joined today by Dr. Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary of India, Meera Shankar, former Ambassador of India to the United States, and Manish Singh, Chief Investment Officer at Crossbridge Capital. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today as we try to simplify and break apart for our viewers what really is going on in this situation. So, Mr. Sibal, let me start by just getting your overview on what this conflict is about. We've been hearing about it from the last many months. We know that it flared up in 2015 as well when Russia annexed part of Crimea, and we're once again in the crosshairs. Why has it become such a big issue in the last few days?
Well, three things. One, of course, the root of the conflict lies in the relentless expansion of NATO towards Russia. There have been 4 expansions, and Russia has protested, but did not feel strong enough to prevent that from happening. The effort to pit Georgia against Russia and offer membership of Georgia to NATO resulted in a clash in which Georgia lost a part of its territory. But this red line was not observed by the United States especially. And they offered, obviously, NATO membership to Ukraine. Then they engineered a color revolution and helped stage a coup d'etat against the elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who was supposed to be pro-Russian. I don't want to go into the details of that. But the long and short is that as a result of that, Russia occupied Crimea after a referendum by the people there, which obviously would have gone in their favor because the population is Russian-speaking and of Russian origin. The latest crisis has actually, in a sense, been provoked by 2 things. One, efforts by the United States and Europe, especially the United States, to once again fan internal resistance in Ukraine to Russia by supporting their president, supplying arms to Ukraine. After 450 million worth of arms were supplied last year, and another 200 million or so have been supplied very recently. Russia, Putin, took to my mind, a rather bold and unusual step of publicly asking the United States to give a legal guarantee that Ukraine will never be made part of NATO. As well also that no offensive NATO weapons will be placed close to Russia's borders, and there'll be no further expansion of NATO to countries which became erstwhile parts of the Soviet Union, which became independent after 1997, which means Georgia and Moldova in addition to Ukraine. Now, I don't think the United States can easily accept these conditions, because if they did, it will create a crisis in US-Europe relations, crisis within NATO, and undermine very severely the international credibility of the United States as a partner, especially after the debacle in Afghanistan. The US political establishment, the Democrats, the people in power in the White House and the Congress are very, very deeply anti-Russian. And Victoria Nuland, who's in charge of the State Department at a very high level, was the one who played a very mischievous role in the color revolution. So these people are absolutely in no mood to make any concession to Russia. And Putin has dug his heels in, and he can't now withdraw. And steadily now we are having a situation which is escalating and could result in an unwanted conflict. I personally don't think that Putin has any intention of invading Ukraine. He's applying pressure tactics. And the United States and Europe also don't want to get involved in a war, especially after Afghanistan. US has no appetite. But they are threatening sanctions. They have revealed publicly what the nature of those sanctions would be, knowing that those sanctions will be absorbed by Russia. Yes, Russia will pay price, but they'll be able to absorb it. And recent moves of some NATO forces close to Russia's borders, Black Sea, is not going to help very much, because Russia is not going to be intimidated by such a small addition of a few aircraft and naval vessels and forces on the ground. So it's a very difficult situation for both sides, and it's a pity that this has come to this pass. And I'll conclude by saying that it exposes Europe's and transatlantic claims, especially Europe's, that they've become a haven of peace. They've overcome past differences. Now they have soft power, which is on the basis of which they've spread their influence on the world, but they're going back to their warmongering. They started 2 wars, and now we again creating conditions in Europe of conflict, which actually undermines their international position. And lastly and finally, that they are leaving the door open to China to expand as it has been, because the attention has been deflected away from China. Both sides will weaken each other, and China will be the big gainer from all this. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, I definitely agree that the attention has moved away from China. And this is a very interesting perspective that Mr. Sibal has put out, because if you look at what the Americans are saying and what the American press is saying, it's painting Russia as the aggressor in this case. Ms. Shankar, can you tell us about the differing perceptions out there, where we're hearing of 100,000 Russian troops amassed along the Ukraine border? And from what you read there, it seems as if Mr. Putin is the one ready to pull the trigger.
Well, I think it's more complex than that. As Mr. Sibal explained, Russia has seen these countries as part of its core sphere of influence. For instance, Ukraine was Russia's exit to the Mediterranean, and also its Black Sea fleet was there. So Kissinger, somebody as astute as Kissinger, had basically at one time argued that essentially they should look at a solution which sees the Finlandization of Ukraine, that is, its neutrality in some sense, recognizing that this was a core area of Russian influence. It didn't happen, and Russia took the Crimea and also, exerted its dominance over eastern Ukraine. Now, for the past several years, we've seen NATO expand its drills into the Black Sea, which is right on the border with Russia. There's also been efforts to place weapon systems, including, missile defense systems in areas closer to the Russian border, some of the Warsaw Pact countries. So I think this is something which Putin now wants to push the ante, looking for some kind of security guarantees which would ensure, Russia's security and stop the eastward expansion of NATO, from which it feels threatened. Now, it's a gambit. It's a pressure gambit, essentially designed to win gains at the negotiating table. And the demands that Russia has made are quite extensive. So even if there is a walking back from that or a concession, it leaves room for concessions. But, it's very difficult because he's taken a public stance on what he wants. And Biden might find it difficult, particularly the new European NATO countries, the East Europeans, would be very against any such guarantees. And so, and within the US also, I think domestic opinion would be hard to shape in favor of giving such guarantees. So in a sense, it's derailed Biden's effort and Putin's positive response to try to ease US-Russia tensions and make the relationship more predictable and more manageable. Instead, we've now got an unpredictable situation where even though neither side wants it to spiral into a hot conflict, it could happen inadvertently.
And that is the fear, really, which has impacted markets so dearly. Of course, when you're talking just about markets, there are concerns about how fast the Federal Reserve will increase interest rates, etc. But Manish Singh, explain to us where the concerns come from. Is the fear that if there are all of these harsh sanctions that Biden's talking about imposed on Russia, it will first of all lead to a huge hike in commodity prices?
The big concern for the market clearly is still inflation, in my opinion. And you have seen both the guests, Mr. Sibal and Ms. Shankar, lay out the ground of what's happening. I mean, one thing we have to remember that there is a complete breakdown of the post-World War II consensus, which is exactly why we are facing these scenarios, not just here, but when you see US leaving Afghanistan in a haphazard manner, what do you think it tells people, who are competitors to US? So I think you will see a lot more of these things happening, saber rattling, negotiation. I have spoken to people both in Moscow and in Kiev just this week. I can tell you domestically, the Ukrainians are ready to fight. The Russians don't want this fight, at least the people. I mean, of course, Mr. Putin can make up his own mind what he wants to do. In my opinion, the risk of a full-out war is much lower than it is being made out. I'm not saying that there can't be, because you can never put a zero probability on such events where autocrats are involved. But I would say the risk of that is much lower. And so as a market participant, I see that risk as much lower. The bigger risk for me has been about inflation and the self-inflicted supply chain problems that we have caused upon ourselves. This is entirely self-inflicted. We can get rid of that. We can sort this out. You see, the central banks can solve the demand side issues. They cannot solve supply side issues. Central bank cannot go in the business of manufacturing goods, running ships, delivering goods. They can't do that. I mean, they can only affect demand. And they have done a very good job, at least talking about the Federal Reserve. So as a market participant, and we have a Fed meeting tomorrow and we'll have the press conference tomorrow. We'll see what happens. I am still looking more at the CPI number. I'm looking at the PMI number, which was weak yesterday. I think the U.S. durable goods number are going to be weak on Thursday. So I'm less concerned about that. But of course, you can never ignore the geopolitics because the consensus has just broken down. And just final thing I would say, this may be looking like a Ukraine-Russia issue, but I would say the impact of that is much wider. It shows Europe in a very bad light. It is going to expose the European Union that it is just a talking shop. It has no method to really deal with anything. And that makes their situation very vulnerable going forward. And the final thing I would say, energy. Think about this, that if the world really wants to go off fossil fuel and go more into green and ESG energy, do you think Mr. Putin will just sit back and do nothing about it? I think that you will have a much bigger crisis coming down the line. Because energy is the lifeblood of Russia, and which is exactly why you've seen the politics on Nord Stream 2 and what Germany and how they're responding to. So I would keep that in mind, energy and what happens with green energy and ESG agenda, because that may provoke Russia even more.
So just to follow up over there, Manish, and you said that, your focus is more on what the Federal Reserve says after its meeting tomorrow. But let me just focus on the energy market in the shorter term and not the long-term perspective that you gave us. Do you think that the energy market and crude prices will continue to be impacted with the kind of statements, even if it's saber rattling, that comes from both sides over the next few days?
Okay, so two things I'll point out. I was speaking to some senior traders at Vitol and other places, and I got a sense that China, which actually is a net importer of energy, as you know, it buys a lot of energy. I heard news, at least, from what I have seen, is that they were seller of gas in the market. I mean, think about this. Why is a net importer selling gas in the market? They are probably facing a slowdown. They see an economic slowdown coming. China has already cut rates, as you have seen last week, and for first time in 18 months or 20 months, and they may cut rates again. From where I see the macro data weakening. as I have written in my newsletter, even in December and before that, I think that disinflation is going to strike back again. The two big forces that we have of demographics, i.e. falling birth rate and people living longer, they are both disinflationary. Technological innovation is disinflationary. The only short bout of inflation that we are seeing is driven by self-inflicted, as I keep repeating, of supply chain disruption. And once that ends, we will have a proper debate whether the world is entering into an inflation scenario. My strong feeling is that disinflation is our big problem in medium to long term. But we have this short-term thing, which is purely because of the arrangement that we have made. And once we look past that, and we are seeing the weakening data in the US as well, I do not think that Fed is going to raise, as some are saying, 4 times. I believe we'll probably see 2 rate hike, and then it will normalize. And just one thing to bear in mind, when you see a 25 basis point increase now, that's actually 75 basis point in old parlance, because we have 3 times or 4 times higher debt. So it's not about you can just increase the rates and think nothing is going to happen. And if we do end up, there's only one scenario I see where Fed can increase the rate 4 times or even 5 times. And that will be if we continue to have major supply chain problem and the CPI starts printing at not 7, but 8%, 9%, 10%, no central banker is going to sit on his hand and do nothing about it if CPI prints at 8 or 9%. So it might be an accident, and that will bring about recession. So I feel that in short term, a lot of things is going to come through, but we have to sort the supply chain out. We have to get people back to working, as this is going to permeate every part of the economy, and we will create a crisis. We create the demand by giving people money and helping them, keeping the rates low, but we are not doing enough to create supply, and that needs to work. And you have seen in UK, we have taken a lot of restrictions off purely because of what data has shown us, and I think UK is showing the way how rest of the world has to live. You have to live with this virus and find means to work.
Yep. We're trying to figure that out ourselves in India as we keep tracking those numbers. Well put there. But, let me come back to the geopolitical situation. And Meera Shankar, a short while ago, Manish Singh said that he doesn't think it's really going to escalate into a conflict. Would you be veering on the side of that opinion?
Yes, that would be my opinion as well. I think at the moment, it's more a question of Mr. Putin backing up his demand for guarantees that NATO will not expand eastward by keeping the pressure on Ukraine, but also threatening that he could bring the US under like threat or similar threat. And this would refer to possible deployments of Russian weapons in Venezuela, or even Cuba, if you recall the old Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a tit for tat, for US deployments in Turkey and, bottom belly of the Soviet Union. And then both sides agreed not to have that. So, which was the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So right now, I do see that both sides are posturing. The problem is that having made public demands and got public rejections, I don't know how they are going to find middle ground to walk back from this.
Of course, for Mr. Biden, after a lot of strong statements, he has to figure out how he can walk back, and the same for Putin. But Mr. Sibal, I want the Indian perspective from you. Why would India be watching this conflict very closely? We have good ties with the United States. We have good ties and traditional ties with Russia as well. How does this all pan out from an Indian perspective?
Well, it puts us and a lot of other countries who don't want to take sides in a difficult situation. As you rightly said, our ties with Russia with the United States have vastly improved, and we want to maintain close traditional ties with Russia. President Putin's recent visit indicated that, and there are some long-term reasons why we cannot abandon these ties with Russia as part of our overall balance of foreign policy. And there are other elements to it, including Russia-China relationship, etc., etc. But there is a lot of pressure, and it will come from US Congress, from US think tanks, from the US press, from some elements here and there in the United States, asking India to choose sides. I've already participated in a couple of debates where I've been asked directly this question. And if India doesn't take sides, as we won't, then this will become another point of differences between India and US establishment, because India hasn't made up its mind. It keeps sitting on the fence. And then people will say it will affect our participation in Quad and US support for us vis-a-vis China. And the Indo-Pacific concept itself will become eroded. And all these scenarios are being painted. And we'll have to therefore navigate diplomatically extremely carefully through this, because we simply can't afford to take sides. It is not our war. It has been, if you ask my point of view, deliberately provoked over the years by the West. If Sweden and Finland can remain out of NATO, even when there was this huge Soviet threat, and continue to be still out of NATO, what is the great reason why Ukraine and Georgia, especially Ukraine, should be part of NATO? Why not walk back from this and have some kind of a negotiated, firm, clear understanding in this regard? But as has been rightly said, and I myself said, that the public positions are such that walking back on both sides is difficult. The only answer, really, if you ask me, are the Minsk agreements. I've gone through them. On paper, they look very fair and very equally balanced. But inside Ukraine, there are very powerful forces supported by Poland, by the Baltic states, by the Ukrainian lobby in the United States, which just doesn't want to make any concession with regard to autonomy and respect for and protection of the Russian language in that region. So Germany and France are again trying to negotiate some kind of an agreement. Unless the United States is on board, this is not going to work. But this is the real answer. And to answer your question again directly, India must not take sides and do what others tell us when we are involved in difficulties with Pakistan here and that negotiate. Peace is the only solution, negotiations is the only solution, and things like that. All these bromides, we should also resort to them.
Well, but the fact is that absolutely. The fact is that if this does escalate, it is going to impact everyone, including India. So it's a situation we're watching carefully, and which is why we thought we should bring more detail to our viewers on what exactly is going on and what its implications are. I want to thank all of you for helping us with that today.